Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Active Assets, State Parks, and Outdoor Recreation, where we will discuss outdoor recreation economies and state park funding strategies. My name is Katie Meehan. I work in NCSL's Environment Program in Denver, Colorado, and I'll be your moderator for today. Today's presentation is the final webinar in the NCSL Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's Spring Webinar Series. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping items. As a reminder, our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar on NCSL's website. You may download the presentation slides by clicking the Media Library icon, which is the play button at the top right-hand corner of your screen. We will send out a notice shortly following the webinar with a link to archived online resources. I know you all will have great questions for our presenters, so we'll hold the Q&A until after all presenters have gone. The Q&A will be held through our chat box, which is on the lower left-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to type in your questions at any time during the presentation. I will gather the questions and read them out to our presenters towards the end. Today, we are thankful to have with us Kaylin O'Brien-Feeney, State and Local Policy Manager for the Outdoor Industry Association, Dominic Bravo, President of the National Association of State Park Directors, and Kevin Good, Special Assistant to the Director for Texas Parks and Wildlife State Park Division. First up is Kaylin O'Brien-Feeney, State and Local Policy Manager for the Outdoor Industry Association. OIA is the leading trade association for the outdoor industry and the title sponsor of the outdoor retailer trade shows. Kaylin joined OIA in August of 2015 to start a new program engaging the outdoor industry and state and local recreation advocacy. Previously, he was the policy director at Winter Wildlands Alliance, where he worked on a range of recreation conservation issues and ran the Idaho Outdoor Business Council. He holds a master's degree in natural resource management from the University of Idaho and a bachelor's in environmental science from Lewis and Clark College. He currently lives in Boulder, Colorado. Kaylin, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone that's on the phone today, whether you're done with your session and or taking some time out of your day. Either way, I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you and also to hear from Dominic and Kevin about an issue or a topic that's really core to what I think about and what I enjoy working on every day. So I'm going to go first sharing a little bit about Outdoor Industry Association, who we are as a trade association, in case folks aren't familiar, and then go into a new economic report that we released in April and provide a little bit of a teaser for folks on the phone to state-by-state reports that are coming out in July. So overall, what OIA does is, as a trade association, our mission is to support outdoor recreation businesses. We do that through a variety of policy means by advancing sustainability, increasing outdoor participation, and then also providing sort of benchmark marketing and economic research reports. So on this slide, you can get a little bit of a feel. Maybe one of your favorite brands is on here, but overall, we have over 1,200 members across the country. We're a national organization with offices in Colorado and Washington, D.C., and our members include manufacturers, suppliers, sales reps, retailers, large and small, really anyone that makes or sells the gear to get you outside, whether that's motorized, non-motorized, water, snow, or land-based. They're kind of under our umbrella. So what I mentioned briefly is officially called the 2017 Outdoor Recreation Economy Report. And what we've done is measure the size of our industry as a whole across the country in terms of consumer spending, American jobs, federal tax revenue, and state and local tax revenue. So we did this report for the first time in over 10 years ago, and again about 5 years ago. So this is the third iteration that we just rolled out late in April. But the bottom line is that outdoor recreation is among the nation's largest economic sectors, representing the lifeblood of thousands of American communities and the livelihood of millions of American workers. You can read the top line results right here, but $887 billion in consumer spending, over 7.6 million American jobs, and those are spread throughout the country. We'll talk a little bit about the regions, and then, like I said, I'll provide a teaser to one state here at the end of this presentation. So you might wonder what we count as outdoor recreation. And I mentioned that it's sort of everything under the sun, or everything under the sun, or maybe it happens in a cave as well. And we added a couple additional activities since doing this report in 2012 based on feedback from land managers as well as from the outdoor user community. But it includes camping, both RV and tent camping, recreational fishing, so freshwater and saltwater, fly and non-fly, hunting, various types of off-roading, snow sports, trail sports, water sports, things with a wheel, and then wildlife viewing or bird watching. And the new activities here since 2012 are a couple ocean-based activities, surfing, scuba diving, and sailing. We're seeing a huge growth in urban outdoor recreation participation and added skateboarding. And then we also added mountaineering, horseback riding, and runs over 3 miles. So it really is kind of anything that happens outdoors. We aren't measuring here playground activities or organized team sports, ball sports type things. So in doing this study, we also increased the number of survey respondents by 70%, and we'll be able to drill down all the way to the congressional district and have that information to share later in 2017 in the fourth quarter, actually. And it's really exciting to me because this economic data is what our business members use to advocate for policies that support them growing as a sector of the American economy. And just as a kind of a quick point, of that $887 billion in spending, over $700 billion of that actually happens related to trips and travel. So those are things like airfare and fuel, lodging, entry fees, lift tickets, guides, lessons, things that would happen in state parks, for example. So about 80% of this entire outdoor recreation economy, or this economic sector, is related to the use of products in the outdoors and not the purchase of those products, which still accounts for $184 billion. And here we're talking about apparel and footwear, equipment, vehicles, etc. But kind of linking it back around, that's why I get to work on policy related to land management and outdoor participation, particularly at the state level, where we see, I think it's something like 760 million state park visits annually. Dominic can correct me later because I think that's an NASPD stat. But that's the connection, really, is that the majority of this outdoor activity is the use and enjoyment of products in the outdoors, because the products themselves are innovative and long-lasting. And so it's all built on sort of a quality outdoor experience. As another point of comparison, I mentioned previously the 7.6 million American jobs, and these range from land managers to the sort of snow survey folks, fly fishing guides, retail sales associates, designers, marketers, finance people, really across the spectrum. Anyone who works in the field or in the lab, on the road, places in between. It's a very attractive sector to work in, and it's one that's growing. So just as this might be a little bit hard to see on the screen, it's quite small, so I'll just call out a couple of the industry comparisons. Outdoor recreation is larger than education, where 3.5 million Americans are employed, or construction, where 6.4 million Americans are employed, and that's because we are such a broad-based sector. It captures jobs, or includes jobs in other sectors as well, including manufacturing and finance and retail, and transportation, tourism, etc. So you can't add all those sectors together to get the number of American jobs but outdoor recreation includes jobs in each of those many sectors. So that's the overview of the study that I wanted to provide, and that is available currently on our website at outdoorindustry.association.org. And then I wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of what's coming next. So in a little bit less than a month, on July 26th actually, we'll be releasing 50 state-by-state outdoor recreation economy reports. And some of you might be familiar with those from when they were released in 2013. These are an update of the numbers using the more robust survey methodology that I mentioned, and will include outdoor participation data at the state level as well. This was some good news on my front is actually I think we're going to move this date up for congressional reports from Q1 of 2018 to the fourth quarter of this year. And then last, on kind of the economic study side, I wanted to mention something called the REC Act, the Outdoor Recreation Jobs and Economic Impact Act, which was signed into law late in 2016 and calls for the federal government for the first time to annually measure the outdoor recreation economy and the industry's contribution to our national GDP. The law and the resulting data will provide policymakers and other leaders with a better understanding of our role in the nation's economic health, and hopefully will become a tool to make better informed policy decisions. That REC Act information will not be coming out this year, but hopefully next year. So, and I mentioned that there's a little bit of a sneak peek of what's to come. We released these Colorado numbers just earlier this week, and I wasn't sure if we were going to do that. I'm really glad that I have this to share with you to get an idea of what you might be able to use or see in the near future at the state level. But just in Colorado, outdoor recreation is responsible for $28 billion in consumer spending, over 229,000 direct jobs, almost $10 billion in wages and salaries, and $2 billion in state and local tax revenue. And this is just a social infographic that has been floating around this week, and this next page is what the actual report looks like. So I mentioned that you have this participation number. In this case, 71% of Coloradans participate in outdoor recreation each year. We have a couple of industry comparisons. Those are the small stats at the bottom. So for example, in Colorado, there's nearly 4 times as many outdoor recreation jobs as there are oil and gas jobs. And there's also a higher index of hikers and campers in Colorado. So more Coloradans than average participate in those activities. And each of these reports will be available on the 26th of July. If you were just to take out that URL, outdoorindustry.org/state/your-state, that's where you find it. And if you want to look right now at Colorado's, that is where that data lives. And I think we were going to hold questions to the end, but this is my contact information. I'm pretty easy to find, and OIA, as a new NCSL Foundation member, is really excited to get more involved, and I'm excited about this research because it's one of the things that we do that's more public-facing and is freely available to anyone. So I look forward to questions at the end and hearing from Kevin and Dominic. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kaylin. As Kaylin mentioned, we will save the questions till the end, so please type them in the chat box on the left side of the screen if you have any as we move forward. So next up we have Dominic Bravo, President of the National Association of State Park Directors. NASPD promotes and advances the State Park System of America. Each year, NASPD releases an annual information exchange of state park operations, highlighting funding mechanisms and park logistics for the nation's 50 states. The reports are designed to be used by state park directors to assist in formulating budgetary requests for state legislatures. Dominic also serves as an administrator at Wyoming State Parks Historic Sites and Trails, where he provides policy direction, prioritizes the budget for the agency, and develops legislative incentives through the Governor's Office to the Legislature, amongst many other responsibilities. Dominic holds a master's degree in Parks and Resource Management and Natural Resource Management from Slippery Rock University and a Bachelor of Science from Colorado State University. Dominic, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, and thank you to Katie and the National Conference of State Legislators for having America's State Parks on this webinar. Hopefully I can provide some information. I think I came in as a pinch hitter, so I'm much better looking in person than my photo says. Just kidding. So basically with America's State Parks, I just want to give you a little bit of background about who we are, much like Kaylin has presented with Outdoor Industry Association. But tying into what he was saying, obviously we in the state parks industry really look at a lot of that data that comes out and utilize what outdoor industry does and what many other folks do, like Top Line Report in regards to recreation trends. Here you can just get an idea of some of the things going on in 2015. Obviously a substantial amount of Americans are out recreating in the country. Another piece is just kind of tying it back in with Wyoming, and obviously these aren't our updated numbers. Although we're a small in population number state, we're a very large state, but obviously we have to pick up the pace to compete a little more with some of our surrounding states like Colorado. But we're still pretty happy with the fact that we have $4.5 billion, and I'm guessing it'll probably be a little bit more when the new report comes out. But having a almost $4.5 billion dollar impact from an outdoor recreation economy standpoint is important to us, and obviously important on the state park side of everything. As was already mentioned, Kaylin kind of went over some of these pieces, but outdoor recreation is a pinnacle piece for what we look at from state parks, and obviously is a pretty high competitor with other industries across the country. So just across the board, what are America's State Parks a few years ago, as much as NASPD, the National Association of State Park Directors, did a lot of work individually as individual state parks, we really wanted to brand together under this umbrella of America's State Parks so we could really showcase what a powerhouse we are and an economic engine. And when you really look at it, when you see that the 7,000 close-to-home parks and approximately over 10,000 units nationwide, encompassing almost 18.5 million acres, and probably the most substantial number for you folks is over almost 800 million visits. So again, 800 million visits, which is probably 3 times the number of visits to the national park system, and we contribute probably 25 million plus to our local economies. So obviously that ties into the $800 billion number that Kaylin was representing. But I think the biggest thing is just some of the dynamics across the board. When you look at some of the things that we oversee, everything from Niagara Falls to the California Redwoods to a pretty substantial, one of the largest hot springs in the world at Wyoming Hot Springs State Park. You can just think of everything from European settlers to we even have a living coral reef in one of our state park systems. We even have something that has mermaids, so we actually have a state park that has mermaids in it. So pretty diverse in what we oversee and who we represent. So again, a pretty substantial group that we are. I'm not going to go over the figures, but just kind of gives the background of some of the things that we are doing. And then, of course, we couldn't do things without partnerships, and I think state parks, that's a big piece of the things we do. So there's numerous groups on here that you can see that we partner with and work with to accomplish our end mission and providing to our consumers. Some of the challenges, and I think that's one of the big pieces that especially legislative offices probably are involved in, is just looking at some of the things with everything from the children that aren't getting outdoors and maybe spending too much screen time to decreases in funding at the state budget level, and trying to find different ways to fund things like a state park system. For some reason I advanced too far. Okay. And this is probably the most substantial portion where I'll just hang out a little bit of time on. As Katie had mentioned, we produced the annual information exchange, and the new one will be coming to you folks here pretty soon. And in that document, what we really try to look at is everything under the sun, to what type of facilities we take care of, if we have reservation programs, what type of visitation and attendance we do, what type of camping we do, how we work with capital expenditures, how we do major maintenance, how we do regular maintenance, how we do revenue, how we gain revenue sources, and those types of things. And what I will say is we're very proud of this fact that America State Parks across the system, approximately 40 to 45% of the park systems are self-sustaining. So what that means is we bring in enough revenue to sustain approximately 40 to 45% of what it takes to operate and function and keep the doors open. Obviously, some park systems are further than that. There's some park systems that are in the 95 plus range where they're able to be about 95% self-sufficient, and others, for instance, like Wyoming, where we're only probably bringing in about 20% of the revenue needed to be self-sufficient. And I'll go a little bit into that, going back to just say that again, we're not apples to apples, and I think that's the biggest takeaway. You can look at the annual information exchange, but you just have to really kind of dive in and do the due diligence, and obviously work with those state park systems across the country. And what I will say, especially at least in Wyoming, and I'm assuming it's probably the same way across the country, we have a great working relationship with our Legislative Service Office. Those folks are very, very smart, super talented, and great to work with, and we communicate with them on a regular basis. And I'm also very blessed and fortunate that in Wyoming we have citizen legislators, and they're very accessible and very easy, again, to work with, much like our Legislative Service Office. So a lot of it comes down to communication and working with them and trying to figure out what we need to do and how we need to work on that. So I think that's a pinnacle piece. And probably the most, and I'll talk a little bit about successes for Wyoming in a couple seconds here, but obviously we'll be going through some of these things that you'll see in the annual information exchange. But park systems across the country do everything from vehicle registration programs, obviously the general fund, they have the user fees, there's trust funds, there's some park systems out there, the trust funds pretty much run the operations for the whole park system. There's obviously lottery and other types of mechanisms where I guess you can call them like the sin tax pieces that go out to the park systems. I'm not going to steal Mr. Good's presentation, but obviously there's some park systems that use that sales tax approach. As a matter of fact, Missouri, just every 8 years they have to put in on the ballot for the people to vote on that, and they just got that reapproved, and that sales tax piece basically funds Missouri State Park System. So there's numerous ways to fund it, but again, it's just trying to think about what that looks like for folks out there. In Wyoming, we basically pretty much the last 10 years have looked for ways to supplement, and not supplant, but supplement many of our budget cuts over the years. And again, it's been great to work with our Legislative Service Office and our legislators, and what we've really come to see is that a lot of the things that we come up with is specific to things that are already done. So a lot of what you folks do probably in the National Conference of State Legislators is looking for those best practices and what you can implement to do the best good. And we do the same thing at the NASPD level, so we are always borrowing from each other. So I've tried things like vehicle registrations, and I've tried things like trust funds and lottery. We're not really a big tax state, so we really haven't tried to do any of the tax things, but obviously that would be something we could always look at. But really, I think the biggest thing for us is going to apples and apples. For instance, the vehicle registration piece would not work for a state like Wyoming. We'd have to charge a pretty substantial amount on a vehicle registration to meet the needs, since we have less than 600,000 people in our state. So even with 2 cars per person, that does not get you very far if you're charging $10 a registration, like other states that have, a few million folks that live in their state, or more than that. So again, I think that's a key piece to walk away with. And then one of the things that's just recently for us, probably the most substantial thing that passed that's similar for other parks. For instance, South Carolina has dynamic pricing. In the state of Wyoming, we were able to pass dynamic pricing that just looks at that flexibility in the market. And they basically are allowing us to set our fees rather than at the legislative level. We now can set them through rules and regulations. But for us, working with our constituents, and I think to the behest to keep that transparency and trust with our legislators, we don't do anything with without a lot of public input. So for us, we're doing some surveying this summer before we even institute any type of increases into our fees or any type of dynamic type pricing going forward. But I really think having that flexibility to be able to operate like a business will really pay dividends in the end and really kind of get us back to square one where we need to be to serve our customers. So again, I think there's numerous ways to look at how we can fund state parks across the board, but I think the biggest piece is just to be flexible and to test things and to work with the public and make sure that we're all meeting our goals to be as effective and efficient as we can with limited budgets while still being able to provide that high quality service in the state park systems that we have. So the last thing I'll say is, obviously I've mentioned it numerous times, and that was some of the impetus of it. And when it comes down to numbers, is just to make sure that in including visitation and including self-sufficiency, that you think about how state parks are economic engines for many communities. So for obviously, especially some places that don't have a lot of possibly federal or national park systems in their states, those state parks are probably the primary driver for local communities. And I know for some of ours, just intrinsically, when we had some high water events, we had some pretty high impact to our communities when we weren't able to even be open due to flooding. So it's one of those things that it's not just the numbers for those specific systems, it's also how those numbers impact communities that have businesses that surround them, much like Kaylin had mentioned. You may have an outdoor industry that's specifically supported by what those parks do, whether that be, the local bike shop that pretty much does all their bike sales because your trails exist at that state park system, or a kayak shop, that goes through the best river that just happens to also be in a state park that's close to a community. So, I mean, there could be substantial impacts, and I guess I would just say that to make sure that all things in regards to that, go through that type of a due diligence process. But I kind of rattled on and probably took up more time than I was supposed to, so I will be quiet and turn it back over to Katie, sorry.
Thank you, Dominic. Last but certainly not least, we will hear from Kevin Good. Kevin is the Special Assistant to the Director for State Parks at the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Kevin has 26 years of experience at Texas Parks and Wildlife. In his current position, he serves as the point of contact for legislative issues, engages in policy development and strategic planning for the agency, and coordinates the State Parks Advisory Committee activity. Kevin also works with stakeholder groups and local communities to foster cooperative relationships and develop solutions to park-related issues. Kevin holds a bachelor's degree in geography from the University of Texas at Austin with a concentration on natural resource management and a minor in economics. Kevin, the floor is now yours.
Well, great, and welcome to everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location, I guess. For this final segment, I'm going to give a brief history of the dedicated funding for the Texas State Park System, and then particularly address the sporting goods sales tax, which is used in Texas. I want to start off by covering what the sporting goods sales tax is and isn't. First of all, it is not a separate tax. Rather, it's an estimate of the sales taxes generated from about 30 categories of goods that is then transferred to the state parks account in the state treasury. This is a dedicated account that also receives park-generated revenue payments. Over half of the sporting goods sales tax revenue comes from 4 classes of items: bicycles, camping equipment, hunting equipment, and fishing equipment. And then, although RVs and camping trailers are commonly used in parks, sales taxes on these items are not included in the sporting goods sales tax calculation. Overall, sporting goods sales taxes provide about 2/3 of our state park budget. That includes both the operating and capital expenditure sides, and then the rest of it, the majority of that, comes from park fees, camping fees, and entrance fees, and then there's a tiny segment that comes from various odds and ends. So a little bit about how we got to the sporting goods sales tax. Dedicated funding sources have been around for a good while in Texas. Dates back to the 1970s. At that time, Senator Don Kennard, who was an avid outdoorsman, wanted to ensure that the expanding park system, which had just received a large influx of development and acquisition money from a bond issue, also had adequate operating funds. The answer he came up with was a 1-cent sales tax on each pack of cigarettes, and to dedicate that penny to state parks. Later on, an additional penny was added to fund development grants for local park systems. This mechanism worked pretty well for about 2 decades, but then by the 1990s, it was becoming obvious that there were problems with the cigarette tax as a source of funding. First of all, there was not a tie between smokers and parks. Just didn't make sense. And second, perhaps more importantly, it was a declining source of fund. The good news was that people were smoking less. The bad news was that the revenue from cigarette taxes was declining. And I'll just point out that this is not an accurate graph, but just kind of illustrates the trend lines of cigarette taxes versus sporting goods sales taxes. So the solution that was developed was the sporting goods sales tax. In order to get the swap passed, though, the sponsor of the measure had to make it revenue neutral. So it was capped at the amount that the cigarette tax was generating at that time, or about $28 million a year. The idea was that the cap would be raised or lifted in the next session. The logic of the sporting goods sales tax was pretty easy to follow. First of all, the user pay, user benefit aspect was something that appealed to a lot of people, and particularly some of our more conservative members in the legislature. Also, having a dedicated source of funding would allow long-range planning and resource allocation by the park management, particularly on the capital budget side of the equation, where, as you know, projects can take several years to go through the design phases, the contracting and construction phases. And then, again, it was a growing source of funding that reflected the state's growing population and the increasing demand for recreational opportunities. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it was a source of revenue that was supported by the retailers themselves and those that were providing those goods to the public. This next slide kind of recaps the sporting goods sales tax history. I should note here perhaps that in Texas we have a biennial budget. Our legislature only meets every 2 years, and so we kind of run on 2-year funding cycles. If you look at this, and I don't know how well you can see it, but the red line at the top shows the amount of estimated sporting goods sales taxes generated. And then the lower line is the amount of appropriations to state parks. Note that after the first biennium, the cap on the sporting goods sales tax provided to state parks actually did go up from $28 million to $33 million. But at that point, it stayed flat for a number of years, as several of our strongest supporters in the legislature went on to other things, and the political climate in the state sort of changed, and so it again stayed flat. Then slowly went down, as you can see, kind of bumped around, and then finally in the 2015 session, thanks to a real full court press by the chairman of our Parks and Wildlife Commission, some media reports on the sporting goods sales tax and some other taxes in the state that had supposedly been dedicated, but the funds were being diverted to other purposes, and public being stirred up by that, as well as some stories about declining facilities and problems within the state park system. House Bill 158, which provided a more full dedication of sporting goods sales taxes, was passed, and as noted here, it was passed with very broad bipartisan support, 138 to 1 in the House and 30 to 1 in the Senate. Now, this dedication is still subject to appropriation through the legislative process. However, in the 16-17 biennium, 100% of the sporting goods sales taxes were appropriated for park purposes. And in the legislative session that just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago for the 18-19 fiscal years, there was an estimated $313 million in sporting goods sales taxes available. $277 million of that was actually appropriated to parks. So about 89% of the available funding was appropriated. And I think that's significant given that this was a pretty tight budget session. The sporting goods sales tax has very broad support. Going into the 2015 session, our partners at the Texas Texas Coalition for Conservation did some polling of the public to sort of garner public support and provide information to legislatures. It really reinforced that this was a good program. 92% of the poll respondents said that they thought parks were especially important in tough economic times. 88% said that parks were essential to healthy lifestyles. Again, it was bipartisan support, and when asked about would they support it as in a even stronger dedication in terms of a constitutional amendment to the state's constitution, 67% of Republicans, 72% of independents, and 74% of Democrats said that they would support that constitutional dedication. And then perhaps one of the most interesting findings was that 63% of those who said they'd never go out and participate in outdoor recreation still supported the sporting goods sales tax dedication. And again, going into the 2015 session, some additional data was provided through a economic impact study conducted by Dr. John Crompton of Texas A&M. And this was a very conservative economic impact study that was done. It was fairly extensive. We did in-depth interviews of visitors to about 30 parks, and then those numbers were extrapolated to the rest of the system. The visitors were asked questions such as how much did they spend on groceries during their visit? Did they spend it in local restaurants? Did they buy goods and services in the local communities? And so the numbers were very locally specific. We really wanted to focus in on the local impact and just the impact of state park visits. For instance, if a visitor said, well, our main reason for coming to the park today or making this trip was we were visiting our cousins here in town and we just happened to visit the park for something to do. Those numbers were not included. So we really wanted to hone in on the actual visitors that were coming specifically to a locality to visit the state park. So in addition to the overall numbers here, which you see that state parks generated $774 million in sales, had a $202 million impact on the resident of the host counties, and then created 6,000 jobs. The fact that we were able to have those local community impacts really strengthened our position in terms of making a pitch to our legislators. And the way we did that was we could say that 6,000 jobs in the context of the state economy of Texas is not a big deal. But when you look at 22 jobs created by Caprock Canyons, which is a park located in a rural county in the Texas Panhandle, which has a total population of 2,000 people, all of a sudden that's a much bigger deal. Or if you look at one of our busier parks like Garner State Park, which created an estimated 149 jobs in a county that has less than 30,000 people, those are significant impacts. And I think those are the kinds of things that really do carry weight, and then also harken back to some of the statements made by Dominic in terms of building that public support for state parks. So in conclusion, just wanted to point out that the sporting goods sales tax is something that has been broadly supported by the public. It is tied directly to park use and is noted by the public and my colleagues here. It's really one of the best options in our mind to provide funding for the state park system. So with that, I think maybe we are ready to go to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. We will now move into the question part of the webinar. We already have several questions that have been sent, but don't forget that if you have a question, please type it into the box on the left. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to participants. If for some reason we're not able to get to everyone's questions, I just want everyone to know that I'll connect those individuals with the relevant speaker, and there will be follow-up responses. So I think in terms of a first question, Representative Chuck Eisenhart from Iowa has asked, for agricultural states with large amounts of altered landscapes, how can you build public support in a rural economy? So I think that that's a question for any of the speakers.
Well, I'll jump in and say that, as I mentioned, when we were able to provide those numbers for a specific park in a specific county, it really helps strengthen that argument, because we were able to show exactly what the local impacts were.
This is Dominic, and I didn't mention this, but the governor had our department run an outdoor recreation task force, and some of the draft recommendations coming out of that specifically address kind of that rural, obviously Wyoming being the way it is mostly rural, but address that rural need of outdoor recreation. And I think a lot of it comes down to getting collaboratives together at those local community levels to look at what outdoor recreation assets you have and which ones you have that you can develop. And I think as long as you include everyone from private landowners to your public land folks, you can come up with a good plan that would make sense for that outdoor recreation. I mean, you're always going to have those naysayers that really don't want to see, increases in population or those types of things. And that's probably what the great thing about outdoor recreation is. You aren't going to have maybe huge increases in your community's population, but you probably could have huge increases in visitors that come, and then and then hopefully businesses move in and keep those rural communities vibrant and viable. So I think that's probably the biggest place to start, is if you kind of get those, and maybe I can share that information at a later time, how we're going to work on developing those outdoor recreation collaboratives to work with communities specifically to develop things like places that have a lot of agricultural land, and really working with some of those private landowners that may be able to enhance their, obviously their coffers of funds through some processes of allowing access and doing some interesting, innovative things. So we'd love to talk to, I think you said as Representative Eisenhart, and I could follow up at a later date.
Great, thank you to you both. Oh, Kaylin, did you want to add something?
No, I was going to say that that's perfect, and I think focusing on bringing local partners together and then being able to show a return on investment is the way that we approach projects like that as well, or making the case. So glad to hear we're all kind of on the same page there.
Great. The next question was, how does Outdoor Industry Association, or does Outdoor Industry Association support local stakeholders in passing public referenda to invest in local and outdoor resources? So Kaylin, I believe that's for you.
Great. Yeah, so as was mentioned during the introduction, OIA has historically worked in Washington, D.C. on federal programs, not just appropriations, but also kind of long-term conservation programs and some land protection. And only in the last 2 years have we really started delving into state and local policy work. So I've been working on individual bills in a number of states. And then also, to this question in particular, there's a great opportunity that we see working with partners, working with local elected officials to develop and help pass initiatives that support local funding. So just a couple of quick stats is that this last election cycle in 2016, these initiatives passed at about an 80% success rate, a little bit lower than that, and that's the rate at which they've been passing for a few decades. So the reason behind that, at least anecdotally, seems like people like to invest in things, regardless of the mechanism, whether it's a bond or a sales tax or a property tax or some other thing, and there's pluses and minuses to all of those. People like to see a direct benefit from an investment, and that's what local referenda do. So I can't say that we endorse all of them. We simply don't have the capacity to. So far, we've endorsed 5. They've all passed last fall. That represented over $1 billion in investment. So my job is really to help find those hotspots where there are outdoor businesses that want to join a coalition rather than starting an initiative process on our own. So I've been able to help connect retailers, manufacturers, service providers with nonprofits or friends groups, citizens groups that are helping push those along. So the short answer is yes, some places, and we're still learning.
Great, thank you. And then we received a couple of questions more generally about state park funding. So this could go to anyone in the group, but it might be good for Dominic. So are there certain approaches that are more common in terms of state park funding in states than others? We had specific questions come in about voluntary giving, roundup policies, and transient occupancy taxes.
And if they want specific numbers, I might have to get back with them. Obviously, across the board, I think that's why I said we aren't apples to apples. I don't know if there is a consistent way that we accomplish any of those different funding mechanisms. And some of them are not even that supplanting of funding. It's actually supplementing maybe possible budget cuts on the transient occupancy taxes. Like I know for sure it's a funding segment of Montana state parks. And the key with that is they still get then a dedicated portion back. We've looked at that in Wyoming, and if we did it in Wyoming, we have a great relationship with our local tax boards, and that's where the money goes for some of those. So it goes to the local tourism folks who then help promote and advertise and market their local area attractions, which many times include state parks. So I think it's definitely something that's doable and something that can be looked at. But I think it's one of those things that it's a case-by-case basis. So I think it's a good thing to always look into and make sure you kind of do, again, that due diligence piece and think about what may or may not work. But I think all options are available. As for that Roundup type program, I believe Nevada State Parks was doing something similar with only as a pilot with some of their grocery stores. Don't quote me. It's one of those things that I'm just trying to remember if that's for sure got put into place. But I know that there has been some of those types of programs. And even in Wyoming, we did a thing where with ATMs, we could work with private ATM owners to include a screen shot that would ask if they wanted to donate to Wyoming State Parks just as a voluntary way to give. But even with that, we ran into some interesting logistics just based on the fact that those private ATM owners had to have upfront funding to reprogram their machines, and it's something that program through a voluntary system. It's one of those things we didn't see coming when we kind of had put that idea into place. So no, I don't think I won't say there's no consistency across. I mean, I think some folks, again, we borrow each other's ideas that are good ideas and make sense, and I think we try to implement any of the ones that are feasible. But if it hasn't been tried, definitely that's awesome and amazing. But for the most part, many of the things have been tried if there's a way to do it, especially because state parks span so many things from education to public safety to public health. So we're in many sectors of the industries across the board. So I think there's different ways that those funding mechanisms can be looked at. And I don't know if that was a bureaucratic answer to the question, but hopefully at least gives you some insight into some of the things that we have. But would be happy to follow up with whoever might have had those and see if I could get some specific answers from how many states actually do any of those programs.
Great, thank you. So a couple more questions specific for Kaylin about OIA's reports. Do the OIA reports include season or part-time work as well? And then a follow-up to that, does it include indirect and induced economic impacts or just direct consumer spending?
Great. Those are pretty easy. It counts all jobs and only direct spending, so no indirect spending is included. Many economic studies do. Ours does not. So if you were to include indirect spending, obviously the number would be much larger. We felt like going with this conservative direct approach makes most sense, and is what we've done past as well. So, and I appreciate Dominic's answer to that last question. It's a really complicated question, and one that OIA is interested in learning more about as well, and being a partner to help find those best solutions. Along those lines, I'm excited that here the next month as well, we'll be releasing some additional research around some best practices on state funding programs for outdoor recreation. It's great to hear about the sporting goods sales tax in Texas. That's a unique and really successful model. There's some other ones out there that fund not just state parks, but also conservation and outdoor recreation programs, and some local matching grant infrastructure programs, like one that was just passed this year in Utah using a transient occupancy tax. So there's a lot to learn, and I think this sort of information sharing is really exciting, but there's no easy answer, except on the jobs and direct spending one. That's pretty straightforward. It's all jobs and just direct spending.
And Kaylin, kind of following up from what you were just speaking about, are there specific states that you've seen that you think have particularly unique or successful approaches that you could share with the audience? Yeah,
so Texas absolutely stands out as one. There's a program here in Colorado which is slightly different in that it doesn't just fund the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department, but some land acquisition, youth programming, and infrastructure as well, called GOCO, Great Outdoors Colorado. That is a lottery-funded program. Then there's much bigger programs that have existed for a long time, sometimes decades, that utilize a separate tax. So importantly, Texas does not, but in some places they've decided to pass a portion of a cent separate tax in Missouri, Minnesota, a number of other states as well. So this report that I mentioned, the Best Practices report, is going to come out in July, and there's 7 state case studies in there, as well as a more comprehensive overview of how funding works generally. But those are a few that I'd key on right now, and I'm really glad to learn a little bit more from Kevin here today about the program in Texas. It's a challenge, but I think we all see the kind of broad-based benefits that state parks and other outdoor recreation opportunities bring. So.
Okay, great. And then one more follow-up question about OIA's report. Does it include outdoor recreational childcare in its industry segment? And the question specifically mentioned things like YMCA daycares.
It does not. Yeah, we did not ask questions in the survey about, say, the cost of a recreational summer camp program or an Outward Bound or NOLS type course. That is not actually included in the consumer spending. piece, but a big difference between the 2012 and 2016 report is that we are now capturing entrance fees and past programs and events, and those were not previously counted. Camps still are not, but now we're counting those gate fees and organized adventure races, that sort of thing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I'd like to extend a final thank you to our speakers, and of course, thanks to all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar, as well as the other webinars in NRI Committee's Spring Webinar Series, will be available on NCSL's website, and the presentation slides, again, are available by clicking the play icon, which is the media library at the top of your screen. Thank you for your Thank you for your continued interest and support of NCSL, and thanks again to all of our speakers. Have a great day.